Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this PAM Town Hall Forum. We're so grateful that you're here. And I am Sally Ann McKinsey. I'm the editor of the Call to Worship Journal. And I'm so grateful and excited to be here with Jimmy Hoke, who is the author of a feature article from volume 57.3 called Widows, Sodomites, and Welfare Queens, The Radical Potential of Queer Lectionaries. And this is from an recent issue of the journal that was published in November called Read and Proclaimed, which explores lectionaries, texts, and preaching. And Jimmy, I want to introduce you first as we begin. So Dr. Jimmy Hoke, he is a campus and congregational leader who currently serves as the Director of Children and Family Ministry at the House of Hope Presbyterian Church and is affiliated New Testament faculty at United Theological Seminary, both in St. Paul, Minnesota. Jimmy's scholarship engages queer and feminist approaches to religion and theology and focuses on queer women in and around the New Testament, early Christianity, and Second Temple Judaism. Their book, Feminism, Queerness, Affect, and the Romans Under God, shows how questions of sexuality, race, and gender impact the entirety of Paul's letters to the Romans, extending well beyond the infamous cobbler passage in Romans chapter 1. Jimmy doesn't let Paul have the only word in his text. They draw from ancient evidence of queer women in Rome. They reconstruct other perspectives on theology and ethics that would have been expressed alongside Paul's in the ancient Roman church. Jimmy is working to find venues to bring queer scholarship to wider publics. And as part of that effort, they created Queering the Lectionary, an independent project through Patreon to bring a queer lens to the texts that are regularly read and proclaimed in Christian worship. And this was the center of their article from 57.3. So, Jimmy, thank you for being here. And please, we would love to hear more about your project and your article.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Sally Ann. It is both great to be here. And Sally Ann did not mention we both went to Furman University together, and we're part of the Presbyterian group there. But I am so excited to have been brought in and being able to bring my queer perspective both to the lectionary, to a wider audience, but also being given the invitation to reflect on it for Call to Worship. And really, this was an exciting opportunity, not only to talk about my work, but really to get the chance to flesh out why it's important, why it matters, and why there needs to be both more investment in it, but also more of it. So I thought I would quickly, before sort of diving into some setup for the article and conversation we're planning, at least quickly show you what queering the lectionary is, in case you have not ever ventured onto Patreon, which is not it is not my favorite of venues, but it is an easy, accessible venue to be able to post something and also be able to generate income off of it. So when you go to it as a public person, you see the sort of general thing, information about it, and then you have previews, but all of these are behind paywalls. If you choose one of the memberships, that then brings you into actually being able to see the different levels, which go anywhere from just queer commentary on the gospel reading for each week, queer commentary on all of the lectionary, and then what I've called the pastor package that also includes translation of the Greek, because as I taught my students in Greek at United Theological Seminary last year, as many of them were preparing for the Presbyterian ordination exams, how we translate things is part of the interpretation, and bringing a fresh lens to translation in general opens up a lot of space, but especially for thinking queerly, oftentimes there are things hidden in the translation that I can bring out and sometimes discuss in the commentary, and sometimes just help to bring a fresh lens, especially thinking for pastors who may have passed the Greek exegesis at some point, but often tell me I haven't looked at my Greek resources since I took a Greek class, and I only cry a little when I hear that. So all of those levels, and then I don't want to go too much into it, but at least to give you sort of the visual sense of what's behind this, especially since all of it is behind a paywall. Then each post has commentary. I usually go for about 1,000 words on the gospel, and then aiming for about 500 words on the first reading, the psalm, and the second reading. Sometimes it gets a little longer, especially when the second reading is from Paul. And I tend to get on a soapbox about Paul. Then the translation, and then also part of the pastor package is trying to do some thematic approaches, both if you're trying to connect different scripture texts in a sermon, here are some approaches, but also if you're preaching on one of these, but you want to be able to bring a theme into your worship service or do some liturgical thinking around that. And then I try to write a prayer sort of based off of those themes to also help you do some of the legwork. So a lot of the way I sort of have tried to pitch queering the lectionary is it's both bringing accessible queer resources to a wider public, but also especially for pastors, lay readers, folks who are using this, also helping to do the legwork, especially knowing pastors in particular have a lot of work to do during the week, and being able to dig into, especially dig into queer theory, dig into queer biblical commentary, dig into just regular biblical commentary. All of that is a lot of work, and so it is trying to bring all of that together, but with an explicitly queer lens. I'm going to try to do a quick orientation to the piece that I wrote, or sort of some of the background around the piece I did. So widows, sodomites, and welfare queens, the radical potential of queerness and the lectionary. And I will note, I'll get into this, but the title of the piece, Widows, Sodomites, and Welfare Queens, was both pulling from, so the widows and the sodomites, you can probably recognize both of those coming from different biblical imagery, and some of the texts that I have worked around querying in querying the lectionary and talked about in the article. But then the welfare queens was keeping, I riffed the title off of a piece that is central to how I think about queerness and queer approaches to scripture and the lectionary. Kathy Cohen's piece, Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens, the Radical Potential of Queerness. And where she, in particular, talks about needing to center the most marginalized of queer people, as well as, in particular, one of the arguments being we need to see how the rhetoric of anti-queerness also gets folded into language like the rhetoric around welfare queens. And so pulling from the title in order to do that. I thought what might be most useful, not knowing who to expect here, and knowing I suspect in the audience there are probably folks who have studied queer theology, have read queer theory, and know some of this like the back of their hand. And some people who are, if it's anything like every church I have ever talked about my work in, a little bit like, why are we using the word queer? I know these topics are important, but also I learned queer is a slur and you're not supposed to say that. And we try not to say that in our church. And so trying to situate some of these conversations, as well as I think useful for everyone, because I am not going to give a long and dense overview of queer theory, but sort of my overview of how I explain queer theory that helps both situate that, but also I find can be especially helpful for folks who aren't used to the language of queerness and where that history comes, especially because one of the reasons I do this is there's lots of debates among the LGBTIA2Q plus folks about the use of the word queer. But one of the things that you can find as recently as about a year and a half ago in the New York Times, if not more recently, is there's often this idea of queer is a term that was invented by academics in the 1990s, or reclaimed, maybe not invented, but was reclaimed by academics. And it gets this idea of being very, very academic. And so as we think about who's queer and what's queer, one of the things that I really like to emphasize is that this is a term that goes back well before to queer culture, not even starting with Stonewall, but we can certainly root it back in Stonewall, and that queerness is really about politics, and the debates around it are also about politics. And so the term goes, we can find examples, and I will at least put these on the screen without completely going over each, but we can find examples of folks in the Stonewall Reader reflecting on and writing from the Stonewall era, using the word queer as a term to identify their politics. And especially we see Penny Arcade using this idea of, officially gay as a white middle class term, and says in sort of distinction, queer means that you have no friends, you have suffered a period of exclusion, isolation, and rejection so profound it marks you as an outsider forever. Losers, freaks, and misfits created gay liberation. So the roots of the word queer come well before 1990, when it got officially coined as queer theory as an academic discipline that is also very political and is responding to the fact that academic culture is riddled with heteronormativity. But then I like to point out, even in the 80s and 90s, queer is being used politically, especially in the HIV/AIDS crisis. That ACT UP, and in particular, ACT UP is naming itself as Queers Acting Up to Fight HIV and AIDS, and along with that, Queer Nation as a radical politics of really wanting to say, we're here, we're queer, get used to it. And so Queer Nation in particular wants to say, as opposed to emphasizing inclusion of queer folks in the normative culture, wants to push back and say, no, queers are bashing back, flaunt it, instead of saying include us in heterosexuality, flipping the question and saying, instead of saying what causes homosexuality, what causes heterosexuality, right? It is a political pushback, explicitly using the word queer in connection with nation, and that we're here, we're queer, get used to it, that we hear. And this then is, once we start to get to the 90s and 2000s, gets distinguished with respect a fight over assimilation and respectability versus queerness as resisting the dominant culture. And so you will not go over these images, but you have Queer Nation saying, we're here, we're queer, get used to it. And this letter to the editor is someone saying, I don't want any part of Queer Nation. Those queers are actually, making it harder for gay people to be taken seriously. And the last line is, no wonder nobody takes the gay community seriously, because of the radical politics of Queer Nation. And I like to point out, going back to that picture of the die-in at the FDA building with AIDS and ACT UP and the queers who are doing this resistance. It is now that we have, not only did they do so much then, but so much of their action is what got Anthony Fauci sort of caught his attention, but also helped his rise to prominence and really helped us develop some of the techniques we needed to be able to respond to COVID-19 in the ways that we were able to, still far from perfectly, but just noting, some of the FDA procedures changed to make the vaccine get out faster now because of the activism of queer activists in the 90s. And so then you have queerness and the academy, and this then gets us this is where Kathy Cohen's Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens comes into the conversation. So she is especially emphasizing the limits of a lesbian and gay political agenda based on assimilation into the dominant institution as the goals. And here I contrast, around the same time, The New Yorker ran this cartoon, and it is two wealthy-ish looking white gay men lounging on a sofa with a dog. We're not doing anything for gay pride this year. We're here, we're queer, we're used to it. So really distinguishing from this idea of gay liberation is over, we can just relax on the sofa, versus queerness and gay pride was always about resisting precisely what the picture is on this image. And so she says, I envision a politics where one's relation to power is privileged in determining political comrades. A politics where the non-normative marginal position of punks, bulldaggers, and welfare queens is the basis, or I like to emphasize, the starting point. We start with the people who are most marginalized, and that is where the radical potential of queerness, which her article, there should be a question mark at the end, sort of questions, is there still a radical potential? And her answer is, there is, but only if we keep focusing on what was always most radical about Queer Nation and all of these politics was, look at the people who are being most marginalized and how do we resist assimilating into the dominant norm. And so Gail, I'm going to move quickly so we can get to the conversation, but Gail Rubin in 1984 as another influential figure in my queer politics really emphasizes queerness, right? Gender and sexuality are always political, political and economic, and we can't talk about either without looking at the politics. And I mentioned Gail Rubin because so much of what she says rings out really relevant in all of the battles we are seeing in anti-trans and anti-drag legislation, and especially the ways in which the politics of children are being used. And she talks about this in her piece in 1984. She says, this is being used politically, and we have not figured out how to talk politically about sex and gender. And the radical potential of queerness is to name the politics and talk about the politics and resist the assimilationist dominant politics. And so then to get us into, okay, all of that was sort of general queer theory. To situate all of this in, how does this get us to the Bible and the lectionary? I will bring up two other influential queer scholars, Lauren Berlant and Michael Warner. They were writing for the Academy, what does queer theory teach us about X? And one of their points in the article is, despite this idea of queer theory became popular in academia, and it's taken over the academic institution, one of the things they say in 1995 that could still be said in 2023 is, when you look at the number of people who are doing queer scholarship, and especially queer scholars who teach queer theory, the number who are in tenure track permanent positions are very, very small relative to the dominant heteronormative institution. And so one of the things that they say, the most powerful thing about queer theory in the Academy, is that queer commentary shows that much of what passes as general culture is riddled with heteronormativity. It calls out all of the spaces where we have just gotten so used to thinking this is normal, that we don't realize it's only normal if you're cisgender or heterosexual, and usually both. And so in response to that, just recently, they were responding to the question, what can queer theory teach us about X? And so in thinking, what can queer theory teach us about the Bible or the lectionary? I have said in a forthcoming piece, queer theory teaches us that what passes for the general study of the Bible is at best riddled with cis heteronormativity. We read it assuming a lot of straight cisgender ideas. and at worst, and we can probably all look out and see a lot that land in the closer to the at worst category, is blatantly queer and transphobic. And so some of the goals of both my scholarship, but also the public facing work I am trying to do with Queering the Lectionary, is trying to bring more and more, is trying to push back and say the study of the Bible can be more than riddled with cis heteronormativity at best. We can actually start with queer and trans perspectives and following Kathy Cohen, see how that transforms how we read scripture, how we talk about scripture, and how we work with queer and trans folks as a church.
Jimmy, thank you so much. This is really exciting to be able to have some time now to converse a little bit. And what I will invite all of you participants to do is to please, you may post questions or comments in the Q&A while Jimmy and I are conversing, and then we'll save time at the end to address some of those. So thank you. Jimmy, I really appreciate the way that you invite us to start with queer and trans perspectives in biblical interpretation. And I also, in your article, you talk about the ways in which this is a distinction. There's a distinction between including LGBTQIA2Q plus folks in church life and being transformed by queer and trans studies as a lens to see the ways in which our theology and our tradition or our sacred texts are already queer. And so, like, I think about your reference to the ways in which queer theory starts with the most marginalized. That's a familiar idea in our theology, especially when we think about other liberation theology. So can you talk about this distinction between inclusion and recognizing the ways in which our tradition or our texts, in which we can recognize the way the queerness that's already there, and be transformed by that?
Yes. Thinking where the best right. I think the best place to start with it is to go sort of right with that, right? I'm going with the riddled with cis heteronormativity, and where the problem with inclusion sort of comes in, specifically with queerness, is when you're thinking about including into, right? And just thinking how the conversation that probably many of us have been a part of in different ways and in different places, the question of, okay, we want to bring more, we want to be more inclusive of queer people, or how do we get more LGBTIA2Q plus people to come to our church? And right, and often, and there are lots of good strategies. We hang pride flags, we do these things, but often it stops short of how do we get them in, but there's not a transformation there. But it often ignores sort of big transformations. It's maybe putting up a pride flag is very, very important. I preached a sermon on why it's very, very important in the context of a church in the town in the small rural Iowa town where I was living, where it wasn't a session, but their board was debating, should we hang up pride flags? So this is right. It's an important piece, but right, it's also something that's not easy to do, but it's relative to transformation and change. It doesn't require you to actually do a whole lot of things differently. And one of the things that an inclusion often doesn't require us to change the dominant structure. Right? How do we include people in our worship doesn't say, well, what often just gets us to, well, we stop being exclusive, but we miss some of the ways that the entire way we've been taught to read the Bible, the entire way we've been taught to use language. Every major theologian in the Reformed tradition tends to be right, is at least not out as queer and so is cisgender and straight. And also almost all of them are white men. Um, and so being able to say how, right, as feminists have done, as critical race theologians have done, and right, being able to point out all of our theology is baked in to colonial ideas, to
Mhm.
gendered ideas. And the same thing happens with biblical interpretation. And so this idea of, well, if we include people, we can include people in, but it winds up often reproducing the same. Oftentimes it reproduces the same theologies. That this is one of the struggles that I think a lot of LGBTIA2Q plus seminary students, myself included, when I was in seminary, will either find is that the only ways to succeed is to first learn how to reproduce the dominant norms. And you face a lot of pushback when you say, but what if I don't want to read such and such an author? Because at at best they didn't say anything about queer people, and oftentimes if you dig deep enough you can find all sorts of horrific things that they did say, but because they are the pillars of Reformed theology, um, we can't distance ourselves from them. We have to learn, right? We learn to reproduce the dominant norm, and so then it becomes harder and harder for us to look at inclusion.
Mhm.
And so this idea of inclusion into uh, is different from, well, what happens if we, and what happens if we transform things? And I think about this a lot more as saying, well, what happens if we do things differently? And what happens if we do things radically differently? And so to give an example from from some of the work that I do, both in queering the lectionary, but that I do pretty much all the time, and my scholarship is saying, well, what if we, and this follows feminist traditions in particular, what if we decenter Paul? What if we don't start with Paul? What if, and especially, what if we decenter Jesus, right? What if Jesus doesn't have, what if Jesus and Paul don't have to be the hero?
Mhm.
Which scholars, including, which I should say, Elizabeth Schuster-Fiorenza and Mitzi Smith and Melanie Johnson DeBoffrey and Laura Nasrallah have been saying for decades and decades, that we need to do. But really taking seriously the, what if we start somewhere else? What if we start with all of the women and queer folks who were around Jesus and let that transform us?
Mhm.
And this is right, but this is the challenge, that feels radically different for people who have learned, no, you have to start, we have to start and end with Jesus. And it's not saying throw away Jesus, but what happens if we do things differently? And I think most of us who have experience in the church know it's really hard to get anyone in the church to do to do anything differently. And
Mhm.
this is a radical, sort of a radical way of doing things differently.
Yeah, it's amazing. It is the same text, but just like any other lens toward liberation theologies, or it is the same text, but radically different approach to the same. Um, so we have a few questions that are coming in the Q&A, and I wonder if we could turn to this first one just as an example while we're on this idea of how to use a queer lens for a text. Would you mind, Jimmy?
I was gonna say, I see the question.
Yeah, yeah. The lectionary text for
I was like,
Sunday is
thanks,
a
Jeff.
story about how Jesus raises Peter's mother-in-law, and immediately she gets up and serves him and his friends. Queer this up for me, Jimmy. She rises to participate in the oppression that her fever, while disabling, took her out of her expected role. Why does the great breaker down of walls restore her only to enter directly back into her specified gender role?
I I love this question, both because I have an answer, because I just wrote about this last week to make it post for the queer comments for this week. And so one of the things I immediately go to with the gender roles that comes not only out of thinking queerly, but especially drawing from so much work that feminists have done, was actually why the translation, why going to the Greek and providing an alternative translation matters, is the verb that gets translated as serve, and this is so this is so common in how it is actually gendered in how it gets translated. The Greek is diakoneo, and this is also the term diakonos, where both the Presbyterian traditions as well as many others get the word for deacon. And whenever especially the noun form, but even the verb form is used for men, the word is automatically translated as minister, ministering. But when it applies to women, it becomes serving. So it's the same word that is often used. It's also a term that is used in Luke 10, when Martha is serving, and Mary is listening. Um, and so one of the things that I lift out is I say, well, how does the whole story shift and change if once she is well, she ministers to Jesus and the folks with him. And so then I wind up saying we can actually see her as a queer ministry figure. I raise up some questions. I begin to raise up some questions that I really would love to have the time to dig into further, but at least to say, also, Simon is there, and this is his mother-in-law, but we don't have a mention of any sort of spouses. It feels like there's some sort of familial household relationship going on here that doesn't feel entirely traditional, because not all of the family relations are spelled out. And at the very least, we usually assume, well, there must be all of these, traditional heterosexual pairings, as opposed to say, well, who are these folks? Why are they in the household? Why don't we see others? And at least beginning to say maybe there's some space to both see the queerness of the household, but no matter what, being able to lift up the unnamed mother-in-law as a queer minister. And I connect this then into, this is part of the thing I love most about the Gospel of Mark and the thing I hate most about the Gospel of Mark. One of the ways when I teach the Gospel of Mark to seminary students, I say, actually, Mark wants us to decenter Jesus. Mark's question is, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? And when you start rereading the Gospel with that question, you keep coming across multiple stories of unnamed women who seem to be indicated as the ones who are the only ones who, while all of the disciples keep failing. Mark is known as the gospel of failure, because every time Jesus says something, the 12 male disciples immediately mess up and get it wrong. And yet you have the woman who anoints Jesus in Mark 14, who is unnamed, but she is the only person who seems to understand that Jesus is the Messiah who has to die. The exact thing that Peter gets cursed out for not understanding, she understands. We can also look at the woman who heals herself by touching Jesus's cloak in Mark 5. The Syrophoenician woman who teaches Jesus a lesson not to be sexist and racist, which womanist and feminist scholars have long pointed to rereading that story. So we see all of these figures, and so when I when I brought that lens and a queer perspective to this passage in Mark 1, I immediately said, wait a second, if she's ministering, she seems to be maybe the earliest point where Mark starts to indicate actually the followers of Jesus are the people who are doing this ministry work, who are all unnamed women, which we would like named. The thing that annoys me most about Mark is like, well, couldn't we get a name, especially in the case, so that there's some convenient way to refer to her that is not in relation to the man Simon. But it's really hard to come up with something to say that isn't Simon's mother-in-law, for ease of reference. But being able to see that and then say, there's a healing here, but the other thing I noticed is it feels very different from some of the other healings.
Mhm.
There's not a request, right? And even it's more like the word is she has a fever. And it's never clear that Jesus heals her. She just happens to get well when Jesus comes in. And so being able to also challenge, like, decenter Jesus and say the main emphasis of this story is that she is able to minister, and they come to her house for her ministry.
Mhm. Thank you. That's so great to hear an example of a text that's coming up that you just worked on with the commentary as well. Which connects to a question I had. In your article, you talk about the ways that in interpretation, in the project of interpretation, preachers can use methods of both suspicion and recovery in reading texts. And I wonder if you can talk about those two pieces and maybe connect that to the ways in which your work can translate to many different contexts for preachers. I think it's exciting that, I mean, what you're doing is biblical interpretation, starting in the original language of the text and the translation, and that's what we always do. But with this important lens that we need to recover. So can you talk about using suspicion in recovery and developing sermons, and how a preacher might also translate your work to whatever context they're in?
Yes. And I will sort of say I'll start with the recovery piece, because I think and these both come out of, so the hermeneutic of suspicion and then a hermeneutic of recovery, both come out of Elizabeth Schüssler-Fiorenza's work. And I think the example of Simon's mother-in-law is a great example of a hermeneutic of recovery that starts with a little bit of suspicion, being able to say, well, what happens if we don't immediately focus on Jesus and make this a healing story, and instead what happens if we center Simon's mother-in-law? And we don't necessarily lose Jesus in that, but we recover, another minister, right? And especially a woman minister who we might be able to argue is queer. And so we get this recovery. I suspect that is probably easier. My suspicion is that is probably easier to preach. That the recovery tends to be easier to preach because we're recovering a figure who sits along. It's very easy to see this sits alongside Jesus. I think I suspect and so, being able to say, and this is why it's important, right? To be able to say, to be able to talk about the ways in which, suspicion of the text also comes into it, right? Who are the hidden figures in all of these different texts who come out when we get past the translations that have intentionally obscured women's presence, queer presence, the ways in which racialization happens both in biblical text, and biblical characters become, especially Jesus, become white when we know they were not. And so it's a lot easier to do that recovery and celebrate it. I think the suspicion, especially some of the ways in which a queer hermeneutic of suspicion can be leaned into, probably most often with Paul in my case, but it also depends. I'm now having to think back to when I started the project and we were still in year C on Luke. Mark, I tend to find you have to take a little suspicion, but because I at least read Mark's agenda, it's easier for me to have a hermeneutic of recovery with only a little suspicion with Mark, because I think Mark has his limitations, but he's also doing something that feels really creative that often gets lost because we focus on Jesus. But I suspect that wasn't Mark's intention. But when it comes to Luke, I tend to bring a lot more suspicion to Luke. And so I think both there's a hermeneutic of recovery going to that story of Mary and Martha. I think is actually a good example, since it also involves that ministering word, but it requires being suspicious of Luke, because I follow a feminist hermeneutic of suspicion that Jane Shaberg leans into heavily in her women's Bible commentary on Luke, and she doesn't hold back any punches. The first line of her commentary is, warning: the Gospel of Luke is dangerous to women. It might be the most dangerous text in all of the New Testament. Um, and the reason for it being, everybody says it's the gospel. It's the women's gospel. It's the most empowering. And she argues, actually, really subtly, Luke is trying to make the same argument as the author of First Timothy. He gives us lots of women characters and always prioritizes a less ministerial, more silent, submissive household role. And so the Mary and Martha become a good example of this, because in that story, Martha is described as ministering. And so we can see here we have, right, a great example of Martha, a woman minister who, when I wrote about this, I also argued, right, what happens if we write another queer household figure? Who are these two women who live together as sisters? Where might their queerness be, both in terms of potentially thinking about different domestic relationships that involve non-sexuality, but also sort of jokingly pulling out the scene from the quote from Rent in La Vie Boheme, where the queer women couple say, somebody says, "Wait, you're sisters?" And "Hey, mister, she's my sister." And then later, after they kiss, he says, "Wait, I thought you were sisters." And they said, "We're close." And so I use that to say, well, hey, oftentimes these familial relationships often get used, right, as a safety cover for queer women throughout history. And even if that's not what Luke is trying to gesture to, we can look at that potential to find the recovery. But with Luke, there's also this suspicious piece that I have to point out, because Martha is described as ministering, and also Mary, right? But Mary is the one who does the better part, and Elizabeth Schuster-Fiorenza has pointed out, as well as Shaberg, Mary does the better part. And what does Mary do? She sits silently at Jesus's feet and listens to Jesus talk, while Martha, right, actively ministers, right? It is setting up this distinction between women's active ministry, and women's passive ministry, that we also see in First Timothy. And if you date Luke a little bit later, Luke is writing in a similar era to the pastoral epistles, where that is a live conversation in second century Christianity. And so that piece is harder to preach, to be able to say, well, what if we challenge the gospel author's intentions, and in particular, meaning the way Luke presents Jesus, in ways that, even if whatever you think about the historical Jesus, right, Luke is crafting a Jesus who winds up getting put into this agenda of sexism and patriarchy. And how do you grapple with that with a congregation? And I will at least say it's difficult. I tend to do it a lot. I preach a lot more on Paul, because and people are a little bit more willing to have Paul be critiqued, but I think there's still I get it all the time when people hear about my work, and I am brutally suspicious of Paul, and often get, well, I love everything you do and all the ways you critique Paul, but I could never preach that. And I both nod along, saying this is difficult. There are lots of people. I have this conversation with seminary students. I love this, but what about all of my congregation where Paul's authority is paramount? What about even some students who say, well, I really, really love Paul, and how do I do that? And some of it is at least remembering, like I am not arguing we need to throw out Paul, but he needs a little bit of side eye because he's got some problems that that I discuss in detail. And this then can get us back, I think, the importance of suspicion for thinking about is right, the doing things differently, and that question of right inclusion versus transformation. Um, what about all of the right, and I think similar with some of the problematic texts in the Gospels and elsewhere, what about all of the people who are coming into church and hear these problems or think Paul is terrible and never get permission to never get permission to challenge some of these things, never get permission to say, well, what if Jesus is wrong? And being able to say, actually, that is okay, and there's room for that. And having taught college students in particular, I see it both with seminary students, but especially teaching college students at a Lutheran college, but in a class where you do not have to have any sort of faith. You're teaching all of the students, and we do not assume a faith persuasion. We are not towing. I was not towing any denominational line there. The number of students who that permission to challenge the Bible and say, "Oh, it doesn't have to be right," was like a breath of fresh air that they'd never heard before. And I think I suspect there are a lot of queer people looking for transformation who that is a big piece, is never getting that permission.
Mhm. Yeah. So the one question that I have lingering is about this gap of resources in queer theology, in the sense that there are a lot of just there's not a lot. Sometimes there's not a lot available in terms of resources from this perspective. And so I wonder, as one who is actively contributing to filling that gap, I wonder if you have reflections about, and as you just talked about with college students, but also in churches, reflections about challenges in this gap where there's not a lot of resources, and any ideas on how church leaders can gather what they need to better understand and apply queer studies to their ministry. Um, I also recognize that there are resources and there has been years of scholarship in these areas, but that there's also the issue of accessibility too. So where there are resources, there might be accessibility issues. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna sort of quickly say there are so many good things out there, and so saying like
Mhm.
there's not enough is not saying
Right.
so many people are doing the work. And also, right, queering the lectionary is trying to be both part of that conversation, and also do some of the what I say distilling work of recognizing there's all of these great resources that also are often behind different kinds of paywalls in the sense that different because there are other than the Queer Bible Commentary, there are very few sort of comprehensive resources. You're often having to buy books on academic books on queering Paul's letters, and there are also a lot of great resources on queering biblical interpretation, uh, uh, or queer theology, but a lot of the ones that are cheaper are not necessarily being published by, especially in biblical studies, by people who are PhDs in biblical studies and have sort of done. And it's, I did a really good. I feel like, however, I threaded this needle in the piece was really good. So I will both point to that, but to at least say it's not to say the folks who don't have academic training aren't doing really really good work. It's important to emphasize that. But right. But there's also some right as someone who has done that academic work. It's less something that credentials me as better and something that is like this is training that often gets perceived as making us less accessible, less connected to. But a lot of it is no, there are so many things that matter. One of the things that I talk about in the piece is how often one of my biggest frustration reading a lot of still a good bit of academically informed, but especially folks who don't have PhDs is the number of ways that anti-Judaism crops up and as someone whose doctoral who has studied the New Testament enough to push back against anti-Judaism, but also whose doctoral program included needing to take a whole seminar on ancient Judaism and emphasize in at every stage this is something you need to be able to do and root out from the beginning. Um, that all of these intersectional pieces that scholars can bring in, but it is often seen as making our work less accessible because there are 1,000 footnotes, and then it gets paywalled, if not in the way the Patreon is paywalled, because publications cost money, academic books keep getting more and more expensive, and because they are not generating a lot of profits, they to generate profits for the publisher, they wind up costing a lot, and none of that goes to the writers, or very, very little of it, because it fills a scholarly gap, but it is not being pitched more widely. And so there are all of those pieces. So the how is listening and paying attention, but I think the sort of big piece of how can church leaders do this, or what needs to be done, is a lot more thinking about that, doing things differently, and the radical potential of queerness, and the political side is advocacy. That we need, there needs to be a way in which publishing is transformed, and there need to be more people doing queer work in the academy, but there also needs to be more funding and marketing for better queer resources at all levels. I was at APSI, the Christian Education Conference, last week, and talking with both different people and some publishers there, and was just sort of I was asking, because my church is looking at what Bible are we going to give kids for confirmation, and it's very hard to find something for teens in particular that doesn't come from Zondervan. And Zondervan is never going to publish something that include Zondervan is never going to publish something in the inclusion of queer people, let anything that affirms queer people. The sort of best you can expect from them is not saying anything, which is still a problem. And I don't think there's anyone even trying to market what would market and figure out is there an explicitly affirming Bible marketed for teens, that makes very clear this is where it is going, and from a publisher, that from any publisher, but probably not one that also publishes a good number of blatantly queer, that best versus worse in the quotation I showed at the end of my presentation. But I think different kinds of advocacy in terms of accessibility. We need more. We need these resources. Money needs to be invested into it. Queering the Lectionary is on Patreon because I am an adjunct. I am an adjunct scholar. It kills me that it's behind a paywall, because I am aware most of the as a poor queer, as a not as wealthy queer person, who is culling together part-time jobs. I need the income to sustain myself, but I am also aware the people who probably most want to read this are also folks that can least afford even the $5 a month for the just give me the gospel level. And so being able to advocate for those kinds of resources, other things, as well as just pointing out with the academic piece, also advocating advocating for accessibility beyond cost. So there's both cost as well as my students often would say in teaching undergrad, these complicated readings are complicated, but I'd be able to absorb them a lot more if they were just in audiobook form. But there's not we don't invest money in creating audiobooks for academic literature, which would both give them a wider public appeal, and also would make it accessible for a lot of students who that is it's an accommodation they need for specific neurodiversity. Um,
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it is really it really helps to be connected with an institution or with benefits for a book allowance or something like that in order to gain access to some of these resources. But there are many, many there, and many who are actively engaged in creating them, like yourself. It's just, I think that's a great invitation to continue to think about advocacy. And we're close to time, and I want to just note a few more comments and questions. We had the question, how might you suggest navigating questioning the text when you're also questioning your own sexuality? I think that could go for leaders, but also for ministering, being a pastor for any in the community who might be. If you want to take just a minute to address, maybe respond to that.
yes. It's a great question. I think some of it is, enjoying it's both recognizing, it is the challenge, and also the text can both be difficult, but also a resource for being able um, to do this. I just think back to my own experience of questioning the text and coming out, and just remember my earliest experience. What I often say led me into a career as a biblical scholar was participating in a mock General Assembly at age 17, and it was at the point where the question of gay ordination was under debate, and I knew this was going to be debated the next day, and so the night before, I was like, well, I've never thought about this, and Presbyterians debate based on the Bible. So I'm going to pull out my Bible and see what it says. And I had a Bible that falls into the didn't say anything in any of the teen Bible comments about sexuality, but it was a Zondervan Bible. And if you looked in the back, you could find an index of, look up, okay, what does the Bible say about homosexuality? I have learned you go to the index, and then you go to all of the passages, and what do you find? All six, right? I very quickly landed in Romans 1, which, as a 17-year-old who had learned to read who had learned basics of reading the Bible, was very much like, well, the Bible clearly says this, and as someone questioning their sexuality, I voted no on LGBT ordination. And so I point to that as a problem, but then why I think it matters for how you can use the Bible is I didn't stop there. It felt wrong because because I was also trying to read as myself, even though I was still deeply in the closet at that point. And so that then ignited a whole career of saying, wait, something's wrong with this. And so I started asking questions and saying, I didn't want to vote this way, but I felt I had to, because the Presbyterian Church said this, and I had 24 hours to figure out how to vote. All of the people I liked were voting the other way. There must be some other way to do this. And so being able to use myself to start reading the text, I think it's really important to be able to bring our whole selves to the text, but also our whole selves and our questions to the text, while also recognizing using it to challenge our perspectives as well, and being able to balance both of those things.
Thank you. That is a really wonderful way to think about that balance between bringing our whole selves and also being challenged by the text. And it's right here at 2:00, but I just want to make a note that one of the things we didn't get to talk about was intersectionality and the role intersectionality plays in your work. Well, you went there, you talked about that a little bit in the beginning, but it's really prominent in your article. And so I want to just apply that note to Raimundo Rosales' comment about liberation theologians. I think that in my reference to liberation theology, I was thinking about the connections between or conversations that could be had between, say, Black liberation theology, thinking about God's preference for those who are marginalized, and specifically thinking about certain groups of people who may be more marginalized or victims of white supremacy. So other liberation theologies focus on the poor. And I was thinking about those connections, those intersectional connections between queer theory being for the marginalized and other liberation theologies. So any other comment, Jimmy, about intersectionality and the role that plays?
Yeah, I think, well, and I was just thinking, I think right, liberation theology focuses on the poor, and I think both liberation theology does this well with, other marginalized identities, um, but also going all the way back to Kathy Cohen's article pointing to the welfare queens, right? That you can't talk about, right? You can't talk about the poor without also talking about the fact that when we look at class, right, there, there is a reason that economically BIPOC people tend to have less wealth than white folks, that queer and trans folks tend to be much more economically disenfranchised, right? The same with the gendered wage gap, right? We can look at all of these and the ways in which all of those wind up intersecting within class. And I think liberation theology, both at its best and in general, often says we have to focus on the poor. And I also think about, I didn't get to pull up the quotes from Marcella Althaus Reed, who is a in decent theology doing queer liberation theology, and essentially saying if you do not start with the poor Argentinian sex workers, and you can't create a theology that is indecent as the sex they are having and talks about the sex they are having, then how are you helping, right? How are you helping the people that that the gospel says are the people where we are supposed to start?
Thank you. Thank you, Jimmy, for your work. And you can find the Queering the Lectionary resource on Patreon. Is there a specific link that you want to put? You can just search for it on Patreon.
Yes. And I was going to say, you can find it on Patreon. I think it's patreon.com/queer lectionary. And then my website, there's also a link to it. My website is easy to find, jimmyhoke.com. And
Thank you.
It's also linked there.
Thank you. And I hope that everyone enjoys the issue in which Jimmy's article is published, and stay tuned also for the next issue of Call to Worship, which is called Queering the Liturgy. And this conversation is very relevant for that issue as well. And I'm grateful for everyone who's contributed there, continuing the conversation about what it means to queer the liturgy. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.